Recording in progress.
Okay, as I figure out all my unmute buttons, I want to say hello to you all. I see folks are joining us. I see we've still got some people coming into the room. That's wonderful. Good afternoon, all. I am Nikenge Harmon Johnson. I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Urban League of Portland. For 77 years now, the Urban League has served all of Oregon and Southwest Washington in the areas of civil rights and social justice, and that includes fighting for and supporting Black people and others in the areas of housing and health and education and all of the things that we need to thrive as members of this regional community. I'm delighted to be with you here today as a member of the Housing Oregon Board. So I thank you for joining us on behalf of my colleagues and on behalf of our Executive Director, Brian Hoop. Thank you for coming. As more folks enter the room, I also wish you well. We'll get to some housekeeping issues in a few minutes because I want to make sure that everyone hears those things. But first, let's talk about why we're here. This session, we're going to be joined by our United States Senators from Oregon, Senators Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley, to explain to us new legislation they've introduced designed to address America's housing affordability and availability crisis. They're going to talk to us a bit about their pieces of legislation, and then we're going to have Q&A with members of their team so we can have a deeper dive. But for now, all, please have your microphones muted. You'll have your chance, and we'll also be using the chat box to take your comments and to take your questions. As we get started, first, we'll have Senator Ron Wyden. He's going to discuss with us the DASH Act, D-A-S-H Act, which will make generational investments to end childhood homelessness and tackle the housing affordability crisis by issuing housing choice vouchers to families with children. The point is to greatly increase the production of deeply affordable housing for families. And I think folks in this room understand how important that is for Oregonians, but also for people around the country. We'll be following Senator Wyden will be Senator Jeff Merkley, who will discuss his Affordable Home Act, that's H-O-M-E Act, which will invest $40 billion per year in the National Housing Trust Fund, lowering the cost of housing so everyone can have an affordable place to live. I'm sure that many of you know that Senator Merkley has deep roots in the affordable housing world. It's what he did for a living, working on sticks and bricks before he became our U.S. Senator earlier in his career. The HOME Act was also intended to build an emergency housing program to deploy resources during large-scale disasters like wildfires, which we're all too familiar with in our area. After their comments, we'll be joined by policy staff from each of the senators' offices. Madison Muskowitz, I believe, is going to be with us. She's a domestic economic policy advisor for Senator Ron Wyden. And Matthew Traylor, I think I saw you earlier, Matthew. He's a housing policy advisor for Senator Jeff Merkley. I'm delighted that you're both here. Thank you for joining us. So some quick reminders. It looks like we've had 10 more folks join us since I first said hello. Hello, all. I'm Nikenge Harmon Johnson, and I'll be moderating this session for you on behalf of the Housing Oregon Board, of which I am a member. Some reminders. Please keep your mics muted until the Q&A portion. We'll try to help you with that on our end, a little tech support. Do use the chat box for questions. We'll be checking there. And after our senators speak, we'll draw questions from the chat box, or you may raise your virtual hand. There's a lot of us that are going to be on screen, so raising your real hand is going to be hard for us to see you, but if you raise your virtual hand, I promise that we'll do our best to pay attention and to call on folks so we can have a good, lively Q&A discussion. We appreciate your feedback on the workshop also after it concludes. So in the chat as it concludes in the chat box, if you would give us some of your feedback there, we'd appreciate it, because we want to make sure these sessions are helpful and useful, and we can make them even better the next time we get together. Please join me, y'all, in welcoming our U.S. Senators, Merkley and Wyden. You can use your virtual functions for clapping. You can do your thumbs up. You can even do a little bit of snapping, whichever you prefer. But I'll ask you to join me in welcoming them to the room. Let's see. Oh, I should also tell you, this session is going to be about an hour long, so that's what you can expect in terms of run of show. Let me make sure I've checked off all of my to-dos and I'm covering all of our housekeeping matters. We're pretty good there. I will have a call of action for all of you. I want to jump in now because I know that we don't have that much time with our senators. I want to jump in now and bring Senator Ron Wyden to the microphone. Senator Ron, are you there? I can't see you yet, but I think you are. Give me a hand. Senator Wyden, not quite yet? Okay, that's all right. We'll get there. So I tell you what, Senator Wyden is not yet able to pop on screen. What we're gonna do is go to Senator Jeff Merkley so we can hear remarks about his Affordable Home Act, and then we'll move on to the next portion of our program. Please, Senator Jeff Merkley, if you would.
Greetings to everyone attending Housing Oregon's 2021 Industry Support Conference. Almost nothing is more fundamental to successful, thriving families than affordable and stable housing. Because when it comes to creating a foundation for a family to thrive, nothing compares to having a roof over your head. Study after study shows that kids who grow up in a stable home, not constantly having to move from place to place, they do better in school. They are more successful over the course of their lives. Now they've just got that better foundation with which to go forward. And there's a strong connection between housing security and job security. It's much harder for adults to hold onto a job when they're worried about where they and their children are going to spend the night at. Stable, affordable housing builds strong neighborhoods and communities. And for generations, homeownership has been a driving factor behind a strong middle class, the biggest factor helping families build wealth through equity generated through ownership. All of that together is the foundation for family success. But affordable, stable housing, whether it's buying a house or renting a decent apartment in a decent community, is out of reach for far too many families. Working in middle class Americans today are falling even further out of reach of this vision. And when my parents bought a modest ranch home that my sister and I grew up in, it cost about twice what my dad earned in a year as a union mechanic. But today, the cost of a typical single family home is 4 times the median household income. And that was before the pandemic hit. And it's not any better when it comes to rents. Since 1960, renters' average earnings have risen 5%, while their rents on average have gone up 61%. Big difference between 5% in earnings and 61% in rent. And that means that an American worker earning the federal minimum wage would have to work 127 hours a week to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment. Waiting lists for public housing can range from 13 months to 8 years. Only a fraction of the families who are eligible for housing vouchers actually end up receiving them because there aren't enough units. And even some of those who receive vouchers can't find an apartment that is available with the amount of rent that the voucher will cover. So in sum, the state of public housing in America is in dire shape. And with the pandemic, it's gotten worse. Right now, 9.9 million renters are at least 1 month behind on their rents. And 4 in 10 of those renters think that at some point within the next 2 months, they're likely to face an eviction. The need for swift, bold action couldn't be clearer. Long before I ever ran for office, I worked as executive director of Habitat for Humanity in Portland. And I look back on that with great fondness because there's really nothing better than being able to help a family in need. And at Habitat, we believed in an idea that was laid out by the organization's founders, Millard and Linda Fuller. They called it the theology of the hammer. And it's the idea which says we can disagree on everything else, but we can come together around the notion that everyone deserves a decent home in a decent neighborhood. It's a simple idea and one that is very, very powerful. And it's a theology that inspires me to this very day. Right now, as Congress continues working to build the Build Back Better budget, I'm fighting to ensure that it makes the kinds of investments in affordable housing that are way overdue. Earlier this year, I led 57 members of Congress in writing to the Biden administration to urge them to make affordable housing a major part of their Build Back Better plan. And Team Biden listened. The administration's plan includes $213 billion to help address housing issues. That includes rehabbing, retrofitting, and construction of 1 million rental units in underserved rural and tribal communities. It includes the construction of 500,000 affordable houses for low and middle income families. It includes the elimination of exclusionary zoning laws and the updating and upgrading of existing affordable housing units. Because as we wrote in that letter, the fact is there is no path for an equitable recovery from the pandemic or for long-term financial stability for low and middle income families without investing in affordable housing. But looking at how negotiations have been going, we can't put all our eggs in the Build Back Better basket. And that's why earlier this year I introduced the Affordable Home Act, which targets many of the underlying causes of the affordable housing crisis by boldly addressing racial, gender, and economic disparities, along with systemic obstacles to decent, accessible, and affordable housing for all. We do this by helping everyone access homes they can afford. The bill expands access to programs that help renters and homeowners bridge the gap between their incomes and the available housing. It expands dramatically permanently affordable land assets through a community land trust model, putting real estate in the hands of nonprofit trusts. Then we have to meet the demand for affordable housing by building a 21st century housing supply that working Americans can afford. And that means dedicating billions in new resources to the National Housing Trust Fund, the only federal program exclusively targeted to help build, preserve, and rehabilitate and operate housing for low-income Americans. It means creating a new National Rural Housing Trust Fund to support the new construction of multifamily housing for lower-income families in rural areas. And we have to confront chronic homelessness by investing in supportive and transitional housing and establishing a homeless navigation center pilot program. This kind of program would quickly and effectively stabilize people who are just steps away from securing housing, ensuring they don't fall through the cracks at a critical moment. And finally, we have to address the lasting and devastatingly damaging legacy of federal housing discrimination. And that means grappling with practices like redlining and the damage done by poorly designed urban renewal projects by supporting programs like those developed by Albina Vision Trust. We address this dark legacy in my bill by helping displaced families return to their historic communities through an Office of Restorative Housing Justice, and work to ensure that folks who have been most impacted by discriminatory policies will be the first to benefit from things like down payment assistance, match savings accounts, community land trusts, and a new emergency rental assistance voucher expansion. If we are truly committed to building our country back better, then the kinds of plans and proposals laid out in the President's infrastructure package and my Affordable Home Act have to be a top priority. If we want America to thrive, its citizens and its economy, then all of us need to embrace the theology of the hammer, put aside partisan differences, and come together to ensure a decent home in a decent neighborhood for every American.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. We appreciate your remarks today. I see that our audience is growing. We've had at least another 25 people join us since the beginning of our program. Again, I'm Nikenga Harmon Johnson. I'm your moderator today. I am also the president of the Urban League of Portland and a Housing Oregon board member. We are delighted to have you here. Hopefully you were in the room to hear remarks from Senator Jeff Merkley. Soon we will move on to hear remarks from our other U.S. Senator, Ron Wyden. But before we do that, I want to harken back to a couple of the comments that Senator Merkley made. He talked about the Build Back Better plan, and that brings us to our call to action for all of you, for all of us in the room today. I want to call your attention to the ask that Senator Merkley referred to. Oregon's congressional delegation, we're really hoping that they will all support the inclusion of over $375 billion for housing and community development over the next 10 years. That's a part of the Build Back Better plan. It's being deliberated right now by Congress, and we know how important it is to have these resources. You'll see over in the chat that we're going to drop a link that will help you to give feedback to your members of Congress to tell them how important it is that these resources are included in the plan so that we can take care of all Oregonians and every American in need of affordable housing. To put the dollar figures in perspective, HUD's annual budget is about $50 billion. We're seeking $375 billion over a 10-year period in the Build Back Better plan. So you can see that there's substantial resources that could really make a big difference for many Americans. These are critical needs, and the investment is long overdue. Some particular programs that would be included in that $375 billion, $90 billion in rental assistance, $80 billion to address public housing capital needs, about $10 billion for first-time home buyer down payment assistance fund. That is near and dear to my heart, and I think it would make a huge impact for Oregonians. And $17 billion for the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. That's a tax credit to fill appraisal gaps for single-family homes in distressed areas. Also a key item for many people who live in our region. Our national advocacy partners are regularly reaching out with sign-on letters to demand housing be included in the Build Back Better plan. We appreciate their efforts. There's a lot to be done and a lot of advocacy that needs to take place. Over in the chat box, I mentioned that there's a link so that you can sign on to the Local Initiative Support Corporation, the LISC, and National Alliance of Community Economic Development Association's letter to Senator Wyden. Of course, we know Senator Wyden is already a staunch supporter of affordable housing, and he's going to talk to us about his DASH Act in just a few minutes. His DASH Act overlaps significantly with the Build Back Better plan. It's critical to remind you, Senator Wyden, and others in our congressional delegation, I think, including Representative Kurt Schrader, that now is the time to include the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act in the final Build Back Better Act. The NHIA provision, as currently included in the House Build Back Better Act, could result in approximately 500,000 homes built or rehabilitated, creating a pathway for more families to buy a home and to start building wealth in our country. We know that for many Americans, their only savings, their only a piece of wealth is in the equity in their home. I think we've already included a link over there, Gail, on how folks can sign on for the NLIH Coalition's Housed campaign, #Housed, where you can send an email to your congressional delegation reminding them of the importance of ensuring any cuts to the Build Back Better Act do not come at the expense of affordable housing. I'll say that again. We want to remind our congressional delegation that any cuts to the Build Back Better Act, and we know you're negotiating right now, that any cuts should not come out of the affordable housing package. Now more than ever, we understand the importance of keeping Americans housed and safe and stable. It means all the difference to our ability to stay healthy. It means all the difference. It makes all the difference in our ability to educate our children and young adults. It makes all the difference in our ability to have safe communities. Housing is at the root of all of it. And the Build Back Better plan can make it different for communities across the country. Okay, with those calls to action, and thank you for your assistance dropping those over in the chat for us. I hope that you will take a look and click on those. I will not keep you waiting a moment longer, Senator Ron Wyden. It's my delight to see you. I'm glad that you were able to join us. Please do, we have an audience of over 120 folks right now, Senator Ron, who are looking forward to hearing you talk about the DASH Act and other issues that you'd like to share with us related to affordable housing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nkenge, it's great to have a chance to be with you. And for those who don't know Nkenge's history, I mean, she is the bionic woman. She is everywhere in the community, working for good causes, standing up for the right thing. And Nkenge, I'm just off the plane from Washington, D.C. We had votes until pretty late last night. And this is my first stop being home. And I can't think of anywhere more appropriate to be And in fact, I'm here at Stevens Creek Crossing, and I've had the privilege of watching this incredible affordable housing development grow from an idea into what amounts to a neighborhood cornerstone. So what you're talking about sure makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm going to put this kind of in the context of sort of where we are. When I introduced the DASH Act, the Decent, Affordable, Safe Housing for All bill, I understood that I wasn't going to be able to get everything in the next 15 minutes, but I wanted to lay out a vision of where we ought to go and make sure that at every single stop along the way, I was struck just listening to you, Nkenge, talking about the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. That's something that the committee I chair, the Senate Finance Committee, has had an enormous interest in it. Sherrod Brown, who chairs the Banking Committee, is also on the Finance Committee. So I want to say right at the get-go here, we are going to make sure that that wonderful program gets well funded in this legislation. And it's fine to talk about a bill and say you want to do things, but as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, I've got the capacity to make sure that the funds are there to pay for these incredibly important housing priorities. So for example, one area that I'm pushing for very hard that the president came out for last week is saying that we ought to have a billionaire's income tax. You may have heard recently about all these billionaires that can go for years paying little or no taxes. That's because they don't pay, they don't accept a wage. So they don't have any income coming in, but they have enormous increases in the value of their stocks and their various kinds of properties. And so what I've told my colleagues in the United States Senate is if nurses and firefighters in our community pay taxes with every single paycheck, the billionaires are going to pay taxes every single year as well. And that's going to be how we look to finance some of these crucial investments that we're talking about, the $375 billion overall package, the low-income housing tax credit, the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. These are lifelines for the community. And I want to start also by offering up what led me to say it was time for the Finance Committee, the premier economics committee in the United States Senate, to really step up and deal with housing in a kind of big, major, transformational way so that we push this year for as much as we get and we come back the next year until we have decent, affordable, safe housing for all. Margaret Salazar, our housing director for our state, told me some time ago that there are kids who sleep in parks on a regular basis in Oregon, and they get picked up by school buses or various kinds of community transportation services. But let's just picture for a minute in urban areas, of course, we have kids sleeping on park benches and maybe the taxi will come by and get them to school, or they figure out some way to come out of the cold and get to school. Let's just contemplate for a minute what it must be like for a kid like that to be out all night in the cold. I heard a rumor it rains once in a while in Oregon. So they're out in the cold, they're out in the rain, and then they're trying to come in and learn. Now, I've told a few of my colleagues in the Senate, there isn't any kid in the United States Congress who this year or any time recently was out sleeping in the cold and in the wet. And what we ought to say is that housing is a basic human right, a basic human right in Oregon and in America. And that's what my legislation is all about. And I just want to say, coming right off the plane, being home and in our community, that what we're going to do is stay at it until we get the full DASH Act passed. The analysts who looked at it said DASH will create over 2 million additional affordable homes in 10 years. And the bill will also have strong oversight from the Congress to make sure that the new funding goes to where it's most needed. And you just listed a few of the programs in Ken Gay that we're going to fund this year and build on in the days ahead. Right now, we're moving into the crucial period of negotiations for the money that we need for these priorities. And that's why I think it was terrific. I heard some of Senator Merkley's excellent presentation, and I heard in Ken Gay, you're talking about establishing various kinds of lines of communication online and various other ways for people to weigh in with their member of Congress. Now is exactly the time, because we'll be home for basically a week, and then I'm going to walk in to those negotiations with Senator Schumer and Senator Murray and Senator Merkley and all of the leaders, and we're going to really make those gut decisions about what we want to fund. And I'm going to be able to say, we can raise hundreds of billions of dollars by saying that finally billionaires aren't going to be exempt from paying taxes. That'll raise hundreds of billions of dollars just by saying that those billionaires that have been so successful, and God bless them, we're in favor of success. We're pro-success. We just think everybody ought to pay their fair share. And I can also tell you that the bill that the House of Representatives is working on through the Ways and Means Committee and other key committees contains my proposal to provide vouchers for those experiencing homelessness. So as we iron out these exact numbers and get to the highest level of funding, exactly what you called for in Ken Gay, I believe we can get it done. Strong housing vouchers for homeless families will be included. Senator Merkley and I joined other senators to talk about our priorities for the Build Back Better legislation. And they sure track what I heard you say in Ken Gay. Now, a couple of your priorities go to the Finance Committee. I mentioned the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. I also want to see a big investment in the low-income housing tax credit. It's called LIHTC. That would add nearly 1 million affordable units to the national housing supply. And then the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act is particularly important because it addresses the racial home ownership gap, which is worse now than when the Fair Housing Act was signed. So I think I'm gonna wrap up with a question, and I don't know, Nin Ken Gay, if you want to take questions for me. And I started off talking about that conversation with Margaret Salazar and school districts where, you know, kids are out all night. And she told me about this district on the coast that was rerouting school buses to the nearby state park, Bethany Beach. And they had so many kids living in the park, they had to send a school bus there. So this is the Oregon we're talking about. This is not somewhere else. This is not thousands of miles away. This is the Oregon that we know, that we love, and are faced with terribly hard conditions for a lot of the year. So I'm going to wrap up with a question. I gathered that my staff, Madison, Muskowitz, because we're trying to juggle a couple of things, having just landed, Madison will stay on to take questions about DASH and Build Back Better and the Billionaire's Tax and the like to pay for it. But in Ken Gay, picking up on the eloquent words that you used, I get asked a lot, whether the country can afford to make these investments. I would submit to our friends who are participating in the conversation that Oregon and our country can't afford not to. The damage that is done, for example, to these young people who are sleeping outside, at night and getting picked up by buses and have to somehow learn and pick up the skills that we all want our young people to have after you've been out all night and you haven't had anything to eat, you're cold, and you probably have picked up a couple of kind of sniffles and who knows what is just being in the cold weather for kids. This has got to end, and the time to end it is now. And that's why your agenda is so important. And I want you to know, as Oregon's guy, chairing the Senate Finance Committee, which is the committee that puts up the money, Nkenge, for these kinds of services, we're going to make sure that people like billionaires finally pay their fair share. So our community is one. We appreciate success. We're glad that people are successful, but we also know that everybody has to get ahead. That's what this cause is all about, making sure that everybody has an opportunity to have a decent roof over their head, floor under their feet. And that's what I'm committed to doing. So big thanks to you and everybody participating. And I guess I'd like to also end, being the chairman of the committee, I can kind of make motions in Nkenge. And so I want to make a motion that we can vote on right now. And my motion is to ask unanimous consent from everybody listening that this conversation is going to be continued. It is not just a one-time conversation. And hearing no objection from anyone who's listening, I so move that it be continued, and I look forward to continuing with you and all of our wonderful advocates this conversation as we go into the home stretch and make sure that in Build Back Better, we get the housing and the shelter that's so desperately needed. And you all are calling for it, and crank up all of the online messages you can. Now's the time. God bless.
Senator Wyden, thank you so much for your remarks. We certainly appreciate you. We're going to take questions in just a moment, but I do, if you'd like to show appreciation with snaps or claps or thumbs up, now would be the time to do so for Oregon's U.S. Senators Jeff Merkley and Ron Wyden for their remarks and for their hard work on behalf of Oregonians and Americans who are so desperately in need of affordable, accessible, safe, and stable housing. Thank you so much for being with us today. And we're delighted now to be joined by Madison Muskowitz, Domestic Economic Policy Advisor for the office of Senator Ron Wyden, and also Matthew Traylor. I see you there, Matthew. Hi. Housing Policy Advisor for Senator Jeff Merkley. As a former Senate staffer, it delights me no end to have you here with us, because I know that you're the folks who do the nitty gritty. We can see you're surrounded there by file cabinets, Matthew, and that you will have a nuts and bolts information for us. So I'm excited that we have a chance to ask questions of you. And we've already got some questions in the chat, so we'll jump into those. Let me go to our first question. Oh, I see your comment over in the chat. Thank Ruth Atkins. Let's see, Teresa. What are Senator Wyden and Senator Merkley's red lines as it applies to the Build Back Better Act? Specifically, what is non-negotiable related to funding for housing insecurity in the U.S.? I'm going to start with you, Madison. If you'll talk to us about, what's the red line for your boss in these negotiations, and then we'll move on to you, Matthew.
Yeah, absolutely. Nkenge, thank you so much for putting this event together. I really appreciate the opportunity to join and talk further about these really important priorities. Senator Wyden's red line is vouchers for people experiencing homelessness. That's something that's absolutely been on the chopping block, and it's something that Senator Wyden's going to go to the mat for, because knowing the number of families with young kids and young people aging out of the child welfare system are absolutely, so vulnerable. And we know that the number one predictor of being homeless as an adult is experiencing homelessness as a child. And so to stop, the cycle and really put a dent in the crisis of homelessness, getting vouchers out to families and people experiencing homelessness is incredibly important. So that's something that he's really going to continue fighting for sure.
Matthew, please. What are the red lights for your boss?
Yeah, sure. I can jump here, and thank you, Nikenge. Thanks everyone for joining this conversation. I'd say that Senator Merkley's priority is really trying to maintain significant broad investments in this package. Unfortunately, we thought we were going really strong, I think, for a while. And, both Senator Wyden and Senator Merkley have been definitely kind of doing letters and doing other, taking other opportunities to emphasize the broad investment of affordable housing. We saw, I think, a really strong bill come out of House Financial Services just a couple of weeks ago, including vouchers, of course, including, funding for lead remediation, including funding for the National Housing Trust Fund. So, I don't think there's a specific red line, because I think that would be sort of too narrow, actually. I know it's sort of being vague, but I don't mean it that way. I mean that if this gets too narrow, if this gets too small, that's going to really defeat the entire purpose of this bill. If we don't have, investments in affordable housing stock, in rental assistance, in things like lead paint, I mean, we cannot allow these to continue. So that's definitely his primary focus. This is kind of a rare opportunity to make a huge investment and bring our housing policy and stock into the 21st century. Thanks.
Thank you both. So we have a question from Alexander Wallace. Thanks, Alexander. It was posed to Senator Wyden, but Senator Merkley's staffer may have something to say about this too. Has there been any discussion around expanding HUD's eligibility requirements for as part of Build Back Better? For example, Alexander asked, full-time college students are not currently allowed to live in LIHTC-backed housing because of HUD guidelines.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. So Senator Wyden's DASH Act makes a lot of those little nitty-gritty changes to LIHTC and many other housing programs that are run through HUD. Unfortunately, because of the mechanism that we're going to be using in the Build Back Better agenda, reconciliation, it really limits the opportunity to make specific policy changes. And I'm sure that Matt could explain this a little more eloquently, but reconciliation essentially allows Senate to invest a lot of dollars in existing programs or some new programs, but it really limits the ability to make fine-tuned policy changes that aren't connected to a specific dollar amount investment. So I don't believe that's something that can be addressed specifically in Build Back Better, but at the end of last year, at the end of every year, there are usually some bills that pass to tie up loose ends in the tax code. And last year, my boss secured a floor for the 4% low-income housing tax credit, which has brought tens of millions of dollars to Oregon developments. And there's definitely a possibility that we could try to squeeze it through at the end of the year. And Matt, if you have anything to add to that, please.
I could not have said it better than that. I would just say, similar to what Madison described, we may not be able to get the level of detail in this bill, but that's partly why our bosses have introduced legislation to really spell out other ways, the ways we would want to expand eligibility. In our legislation, the Affordable Home Act, for example, we expand eligibility for vouchers to tribal communities who are currently ineligible. So, and that's just one area where we're absolutely trying to expand and scale up in general, right? As we know, only about a quarter of currently eligible people receive any assistance at all. So, the categorical expansion is important too, but just expanding to cover all eligible people is really, I think, an equally important, priority for expansion.
I appreciate that. I'm going to slip a question in here for you. Now, we know that most of our congressional delegation is supportive of the Build Back Better Act, and there are nuances and there's lots of negotiation happening. But I always think about folks in other states. And does it matter? Does it make any difference at all if I, as an Oregonian and someone who votes here and who has great U.S. senators, if I also send a letter to folks, I don't know, let's say in Wisconsin or maybe in Texas, urging U.S. senators there to stand up for the Build Back Better Act? Does it matter if we chime into other folks, or should we save our breath? What do you think?
Madison, feel free to
Don't
share your view.
Go ahead,
My
Matt.
point is, I'd say it's best to reach out to people in other states and encourage them to reach out, directly. It is a matter of fact that politicians are much more responsive to people who live who are their constituents. So definitely do that outreach, but if I'm sure almost everyone on this call knows someone who has some sort of sister organization or some connection to be able to express your support for housing, but tell them to do it directly.
Yeah, Matt's right. Many offices get like tens of thousands of letters and calls every month, and they do prioritize their own constituents. I'll add, in addition to reaching out to sister organizations you may have in those kind of key states, that there are a lot of programs out there that connect, you as an advocate to an interested constituent in those key states, so that you're able to encourage them, to be more involved. And it can kind of be this, snowball effect of getting more people on board with this really crucial issue. But I think that, I know that, many of the advocacy groups are part of those national networks. And I know for a fact that Oregon's, housing advocacy community is really unparalleled nationally. And I think that the work that you all are doing and your energy behind the necessity of these investments in Build Back Better, should absolutely inspire other folks in other states to step up the pressure and really keep it on in this next week, which, Senator Wyden said is absolutely vital.
Thank you both for that. We'll go to more questions in the chat, but that's valuable for us to hear. We should call our cousins, our friends, our aunties, our colleagues in other states, encourage them to be taking on this kind of advocacy too, if they're not already. I appreciate that tip. Thank you. Coy asked a question. What can be done about the Section 42 affordable housing complexes that owners are taking out of the affordable housing program and returning to market rate rents? That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah,
Madison, I see you nodding. So do you want to go first, please?
Definitely. This is something that Senator Wyden is really passionate about. It's kind of a niche issue, but the LIHTC program, which is Section 42, is the section of the tax code that houses LIHTC, a little lingo in there. So the LIHTC program loses about 10,000 units of affordable housing every year. They fall out of the affordability protections of LIHTC, and folks who are living in those units have to start paying market rent, and that could be a jump of several $100s a month. Some of this is due to a loophole in Section 42 called qualified contracts. It's far too complex to even attempt to explain, but essentially it allows these wealthy institutional investors, private investors, to cut the affordability period in half from 30 years to 15 years. And my boss has been working for a while now in convincing his colleagues to prevent that from happening and close that loophole. So that's part of the DASH Act. It's included in that legislation. And my boss is also looking for ways to advance that on a bipartisan basis. And then another piece of this is allowing a right of first refusal. So allowing residents of a LIHTC building or a nonprofit in the area to offer to buy up the property in order to keep it permanently affordable if it's going to, the affordability restrictions are going to expire, or someone else is trying to buy it out. And that is something that, you know, the private equity folks who want to buy up these affordable complexes, they're fighting really hard against my boss on this one, because they see housing not as a right, but, you know, as a profitable opportunity for them, no matter the cost to the people who are living there. And that's something that my boss finds totally unacceptable. And he's going to continue to find ways to protect the affordability of those Section 42 programs. So it's a great question, and definitely something that Senator Wyden is chair of the Finance Committee, which covers the tax code, is all in on fixing that. So I appreciate you raising it.
Thank you for that answer. We appreciate you. Lane Thomas is in the chat box and notes, private equity funds are buying and renting homes at a rate that is impacting rents. What can be done at the federal level to combat this trend? And you addressed a bit of that. I wonder if there's more that can be done to combat these private equity firms, especially, I mean, you know, this is Oregon. We're not a very big state, and we're a super affordable state when it comes to real estate. If you're a private equity fund, for Oregonians, not so much, but we've seen what the impacts are in places like Salem. We've seen what the impacts are in Bend, and we're seeing them in Southern Oregon. And I think it's only going to continue to creep up. So I appreciate the question, Lane. What else can be done to push back for affordable housing providers that are in this room, for others that want to be able to maintain this affordable housing at the local levels? But we're seeing the big boys with their big B billions showing up to buy it up. Are there any other levers that we can push, or any other legislation that we can help support? Matt, can you answer that question, and then maybe Madison?
Yeah, sure. I'll be brief. I mean, honestly, it's something I'm still trying to figure out the best solution. I have a few ideas for sure. One of them is to work through Fannie and Freddie and to use those levers to restrict the ability of these predatory investors to accumulate, really substantial investments from their perspective. But to me, they're much more public resource. And, to the extent that our government is underpinning that in any way, I think there's definitely a greater role for Fannie and Freddie to step in there. And to the extent, one of the things we learned about the housing crisis in 2008 and 9 and 10 was that a lot of these investors were able to bid on huge tranches of houses, basically of defaulted mortgages, right? Directly from Fannie and Freddie too. And then because it was easier for them to sell off a tranche of 10,000 delinquent mortgages in one fell swoop, and what kind of normal organization, housing authority or, affordable housing group in Oregon could buy 10,000, at a time? They couldn't compete. So that's not the whole picture, but I think, that's one area to force Fannie and Freddie again to either set aside delinquent mortgages so that people, so that organizations like housing authorities, state housing finance agencies, nonprofits, whoever may be, has a fair chance to restore those to the affordable housing stock, not the investment stock. Either set them aside or limit the numbers entirely. Just say, we're not doing these big tranches anymore. We're doing them a couple at a time, and everyone can, everyone's going to have a fair shot at these. And so NOAA or, some other group in Oregon could come together and buy a few, and that would, I think, make a big difference. But we're probably going to need something even more than what I've thought of so far. So I'm glad you asked that question. We're trying to work on it.
I love that idea. It's fantastic. It comforts me, and I hope it does other folks in the audience to hear that we have folks that are thinking the same way that some of us do, who are out here as practitioners in the field. That's hugely important. If there were smaller tranches, no tranches at all, then some of us who are doing the good work would have a shot to get our hands on some of that housing stock. It would make all the difference, quite frankly, especially in a small state like Oregon. It would make all the difference. Madison, did you want to add anything about that?
I appreciate the question, and I think that it's something that deserves a lot more scrutiny on the federal level, and it's something that's kind of snuck under a lot of folks in Washington's noses for years now, and it definitely does need to be addressed. And part of the reason that my boss has been all in on increasing taxes for the wealthiest 1% and billionaires, like you mentioned, is because these companies, these private equity companies, if you go all the way up the chain, they're owned by people, and being able to tax those people at a rate that demonstrates they can't run amok in our economy scot-free and impact people's lives like this is incredibly valuable. And I think that the senator is going to continue looking for specific ways that he can emphasize that, for sure.
Thank you both so much. And I'm seeing kudos over in the chat, thanking you both for being here. Our next, and to our folks in the audience, we've got more than 115 people with us. Thank you so much for being a part of this Housing Oregon conference session featuring our U.S. Senators, Jeff Merkley and Senator Ron Wyden. As a reminder, I'm Nikenge Harmon Johnson, the president of the Urban League and a proud Housing Oregon board member. With us right now are two policy advisors for Senator Wyden and Senator Merkley, respectively. We still have time for some of your questions. I'm going to keep them both here to the bitter end, so feel free to drop your question in the chat, and I will get to as many as I can. Our next question, and thank you, is from Megan. She thanks our senators and both of you, Matt and Madison, for devoting time to these important topics. Megan says, I was dismayed not to see Oregon as one of the 25 initial regions / states to be a part of HUD's House America initiative. I know, Megan, we get left out of things so many times. I find it frustrating as well. Our state has one of the highest per capita rates of houselessness in the nation, and we desperately need additional federal resources to address these issues at scale. No doubt about it. Do you, either of you, both of you, no, not either, both of you, what's your advice for how we might advocate for additional federal funds to support Oregon through House America and other efforts suggested through LISC? How can we coalesce to request levels of federal funding that are right-sized to impact the crisis in our state? How can little old Oregon push back? We're surrounded by Washington and California, and the big boys tend to get attention, but you certainly know what the housing crisis looks like here in our state, and it's only getting worse. What can we do as advocates and as practitioners to get more resources for people in our community?
I'd love to respond to
that.
Yeah,
first, Matt.
You said first, Madison. Go for it.
Okay, no problem.
Get your thinking going. Go. Yeah, I'll go next.
So this isn't the official. I'm not speaking for HUD here. It's HUD and the U.S. Interagency Council Against Homelessness worked on establishing, those 25 states. And it's my opinion that they didn't choose Oregon because they know that Oregon has such an incredible network on the ground, all the way from our Oregon housing folks, to the community development corporations, community action agencies on the ground, even folks in neighborhoods who are organizing to support houseless neighbors and things like that. And I think they know that and said, we're going to try to route our resources to states that really need that extra boost and kind of infrastructure to support their work. The Oregon legislature has been really involved. All of the money, that they've been allocating, the Metro bond in the Tri-County area. A lot of states are not doing that. House Bill 2001, that was groundbreaking. And I think that there are a lot of states that are way behind Oregon, and it doesn't mean that the crisis isn't real. You all know it is. I know it is. I think that is a big unspoken part of why Oregon was left out of that. But part of Build Back Better is making these investments at a national scale so that it's not, we say $1 billion and it's a ridiculous amount of money, but when spread amongst 350 million Americans in 51 states, because DC should be a state, there's no, it really is a thin you know, a thin layer of butter on a big piece of toast. And so part of the reason why Senator Wyden and Senator Merkley are fighting just so hard for this serious level of investment in Build Back Better is so that, you know, resources get where they need to go. If the Build Back Better agenda passes at that $300+ billion that came out of the House of Representatives, Oregon would be receiving about 19,000 new housing choice vouchers. And for context, Oregon has around 16,000 people experiencing homelessness per the point in time count. So that, you know, and that doesn't even include the housing production, you know, measures. So, you know, that's part of the reason that we're really trying to capitalize on the opportunity of Build Back Better, because it would get Oregon the resources at the scale necessary to make not little dents, you know, not chipping away at the problem, but really, really, like you said, you know, right sizing the investment. Yeah, so hope that answers the question.
It certainly does. Matt, if you have anything to add, you're welcome to. If not, I can go on to another question.
I'll be real brief and just say I totally agree with how Madison has characterized it. I'll just speak briefly on from the context of Senator Merkley's position on the Appropriations Committee. I have consistently tried to emphasize the need, you know, and the demonstrated need for increased affordable housing and homelessness resources using the point in time count. And I won't say who, but there's definitely some skepticism about the integrity of that data. And that's been something that has been really hampering our ability to really, you know, convince a much broader group of people who are running this place that Oregon really, really needs greater resources. So, you know, my thought there is to work to support, for example, Portland State's Housing Research Action Center led by Dr. Spada, an amazing place. And the point is better data, more of a, you know, more feedback loop of getting that kind of research to Congress, making sure that the data is, you know, really kind of passes muster for the highest level and highest quality. I think that's going to be an important kind of path forward. The point in time count.
Matt, we're almost out of time, but
yeah.
That's really important. Can you expound upon it a little bit? So the point in time count, the data from the point in time count is being called into question. Mm-hmm. And that's a barrier to getting the kind of resources that we need. I want to understand that. Could you flesh that out a little bit? And I think that might be our last question, but that seems like way too important for us not to hear more about.
Yeah, sure. It's just, you know, the reality is that the methodology around the point in time count, which, you know, involves a lot of, you know, individual folks, of course, reaching out, finding out, you know, who is there. Like, it just does not stand up to the highest levels of like scientific rigor, essentially. And you see different, you know, you see sort of swings in these numbers from year to year that some people think don't make sense. And so it seems to reflect the possibility that the people doing this, some people doing this, you know, are sort of looking at it differently year over year, or somehow like not applying the exact same criteria. So look, I think that that's being exaggerated. Okay. You know what I mean? There's a small vulnerability. There's a smaller vulnerability there that is being overplayed to say, oh, you know, yeah, Oregon, I know you're number one in unsheltered homeless, but, you know, that's not really the most reliable measure of homelessness. But
sure.
If we could strengthen that and really bring in, I think, something like the research center's kind of academic integrity to be like, to basically strengthen the data from a academic perspective, I think that would strengthen our position to be, you know, just much more stronger about demanding greater resources, because the data show.
Okay.
You know.
And can I add one?
Matt, Madison, I'm sorry. I wish that you could. I have to cut myself off, and therefore you, because we are at 1 o'clock. That's huge. What we just opened up, though, is a conversation that I really want to have more of. So we have a new session, y'all. That's gonna have to happen talking about this very issue. Someone mentioned over in the chat that it's offensive, the idea that our point in time count isn't real. We bust our tails to make sure that it is. I know a number of folks in this room participate, including the Urban League. So it's valuable for us to hear that. Thank you. I'm sorry that it comes at the very end of our time, but I want to thank all 130 folks who joined us today. I really want to thank Matt and Madison and both of our senators, Wyden and Senator Merkley. Also, thank you, Executive Director Brian Hoop and your team, and to our national partners for helping to make this Housing Oregon Conference this week so successful. This was a great session. We really appreciate you, and my gratitude to all of you who participated with your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but you certainly helped to make my job easy today. Again, I'm Nikengae Harmon Johnson of the Urban League and the Housing Oregon Board, and I thank all of you for joining us. Please, on to your next sessions, and have a great weekend. Thank you all so much. Bye, Madison. Bye, Matt. Thanks again.